In the heart of antebellum Charleston, where grand plantations masked unspeakable cruelty, one enslaved man turned unimaginable loss into a calculated quest for justice. His name was Solomon Fairfax, a healer whose wisdom made him invaluable, yet powerless against a system that shattered families without mercy. Over 4 relentless years, Solomon orchestrated a revenge so chilling, it echoed through Southern folklore for generations. This is the true story of defiance, buried secrets, and the high price of vengeance in America's darkest chapter. A tale that Charleston whispered in fear, but history dared not forget. Welcome to Faded Truth's History. If this hooks you, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and ring the bell. Let's dig into Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Healer in Chains. Solomon Fairfax arrived in Charleston in 1838, chained at the wrists, the salt smell of the harbour mixing with sweat, fear, and rotting wood in the hull of the coastal slave ship. He was 22. On the auction block, he looked like every other young man forced to stand half naked before a crowd, but the traders advertised something special. Boy knows herbs, keeps folk alive. That one sentence changed everything about where he would live, how he would work, and how his revenge would one day become possible. Solomon's skill came from far beyond Virginia fields. As a child, he had watched his grandmother crush leaves and roots with a worn wooden pestle, whispering prayers in a language slave owners dismissed as gibberish. She knew which bitter bark cooled fevers, which blossoms calmed the heart, which roots stopped bleeding. When a child convulsed with malaria or a man's leg turned black from infection, white owners called it luck if the patient survived. Solomon knew it wasn't luck. It was dosage, timing, and the stubborn decision to fight death with every plant the earth would give. In Charleston, that knowledge made him valuable in a different way. The city was a paradox: marble steps and gas lamps above, filth-clogged alleys and open sewers below. Disease moved through its streets like fog, yellow fever in summer, dysentery after every flood, infections in every cramped yard. Plantation owners and merchants wanted profit, not corpses. So when a wealthy physician named Dr. Elias Hawthorne heard of a Negro boy who could stop fevers that baffled country doctors, he bought Solomon almost on sight. Hawthorne's house on Broad Street was part home, part private clinic. By law and custom, Solomon was just property. In practice, he became something stranger, a silent partner in keeping Charleston's elite alive. Mornings began before sunrise. Hawthorne would bark orders while shrugging on his coat. Solomon would move through the shadows of the surgery room, lighting lamps, boiling water, laying out saws and scalpels, preparing jars of herbs beside glass vials of European medicines. To the patients, he was invisible. White men groaned on polished tables, their wives hovered at the door, and Hawthorne took the credit when a fever broke or a wound closed clean. But when the doctor stepped out to reassure a family, it was Solomon who adjusted a compress, changed a bandage, slipped a bitter infusion between cracked lips. He knew the line between healing and harm better than anyone in that house. One extra pinch of foxglove slowed the heart too much. One missing leaf meant the infection would win. Working that line, day after day, he learned something dangerous: how much control over life and death fit into the palm of a hand. His position gave him freedoms most enslaved people in Charleston never saw. Freedoms that looked like privilege from the outside, but felt like sand in the mouth. Hawthorne sent him alone to apothecary shops to purchase laudanum, quinine, bandages, and alcohol. Shopkeepers watched him, but they could not follow him everywhere. On those walks, Solomon memorized the city, the pattern of patrol routes, the alleys that stayed empty at night, the squares where rich men drank and laughed under gas lamps, while chained workers emptied their chamber pots into the gutters. He learned which back doors of warehouses were never locked, which churchyards stayed open after dark, where carts full of dirt and lime left the city's dead. At the same time, he saw what medicine could not fix. From the windows of the Hawthorne house, he could see the small courtyard where the family's other enslaved workers slept in cramped sheds. In summer heat, sick children lay on pallets with no doctor summoned. "They'll either live or they won't," Mrs. Hawthorne would say with a shrug. When one housemaid developed a deep cough that turned bloody, Hawthorne refused to waste time or medicine on her. Solomon watched her die in 3 weeks, knowing exactly which herbs might have eased her lungs, but never being allowed to touch her with them. That hypocrisy cut deeper than any whip. Inside the house, rich strangers begged for his help and never once looked him in the eye. Outside, people like him begged for help and were told they weren't worth the cost. Every life he saved with his hands was another reminder that his own life and the lives of those he cared about could be bought, sold, or discarded on a whim. Yet there were small pockets of humanity that kept him from going numb. Late at night, when the house quieted, the kitchen became neutral ground. The cook, an older woman named Hester, let him sit by the dying coals after long days. She would pass him a crust of bread or a piece of salted meat and talk under her breath so the walls wouldn't hear. From her, Solomon learned the whispered histories of Charleston, stories of men and women who ran, who resisted, who poisoned cruel overseers or led quiet strikes in the docks by simply working slower in unison. Most of those stories ended the same way: whipping post, noose, disappearance. But Hester always ended with one line: "Still, the stories live. That's something they can't burn." Solomon also met others in Hawthorne's orbit: a stable hand who could read scraps of newspaper, a laundress whose brother had been sold south after speaking back to an overseer, a scarred dock worker who claimed there had once been a plot to set half the city's warehouses on fire. Each story planted another seed. Resistance, he began to understand, didn't always look like open revolt. Sometimes it was a hidden blade. Sometimes it was simply remembering names that the world wanted erased. By 1840, white Charlestonians called him the doctor's boy, or that miracle Negro, never learning his full name, never caring that Fairfax had belonged to his grandfather long before any bill of sale. In private, among his own people, he was just Solomon. They came to him quietly after dark with swollen joints, infected cuts, and night terrors from whips and chains. He treated them with the same care he gave Hawthorne's paying patients, using bits of herbs he kept for himself, stolen from the doctor's supplies, or collected from patches of wild growth along ditches and fences. Every time he eased someone's pain, word of his gift spread a little further. With each new whisper, another planter, merchant, or ship captain sent for Dr. Hawthorne, with a condition: bring the Negro with the herbs. Solomon never saw the money that changed hands, but he saw the pattern. The men who held power over him now depended on him. They trusted him to touch their bodies, to mix their medicines, to stand inches from their faces while they lay weak and half-conscious. That trust was not affection. It was arrogance. These men believed that fear and law were enough to keep him obedient. They could not imagine that someone in chains might see beyond survival, might think 10 moves ahead, might silently catalogue every humiliation and every name. For a time, Solomon forced himself to be grateful for the narrow, fragile advantages his position gave him. He was not out in the rice swamps, waist-deep in water and mosquitoes. He did not feel the overseer's whip as often as the men on nearby plantations. He slept in a cramped attic, but it was his attic. He sometimes ate leftovers that still held warmth, not cold cornmeal scraped from the bottom of a pot. If he squinted hard enough, he could almost pretend he was building a life inside the cage he'd been given. That illusion shattered one grey afternoon in late 1841. Rain hammered the slate roof. Thunder rolled over the harbour. Solomon was grinding willow bark at the work table when Hawthorne's front door burst open and a drenched messenger stumbled into the hall, shouting for the doctor. A child was sick, he gasped. A planter's only son on a nearby estate, burning with fever, raving in delirium. The family was desperate. They had heard of Hawthorne. More importantly, they had heard of the enslaved healer who travelled with him. Hawthorne cursed the weather, but snatched up his bag and ordered Solomon to pack the herbs and instruments they'd need for a long night's work. The urgency in the messenger's voice told Solomon this would not be a simple house call. It meant riding out of the city into plantation country, where owners had more land, more slaves, and far fewer eyes from the outside world. As Solomon swung into the wagon beside Hawthorne, rain already soaking through his thin shirt, he didn't know yet which estate awaited them, or whose name would be on the iron gate they passed. He didn't know that beyond that gate lived the man who had already torn his family apart. He didn't know that this journey, taken in the name of saving a white child's life, would become the first step toward a revenge 9 graves deep. What he did know, as the wagon jolted through muddy streets and out toward the dark line of trees, was that he had never felt the air so heavy. The sky pressed low, the wind carried the smell of wet earth and something else he couldn't name. A tension, like the moment just before a wound breaks open. Solomon wrapped his fingers tighter around the bag in his lap, full of medicines that could heal or harm. For the first time, he let himself imagine, clearly, what it would mean to choose. Chapter 2. A Debt Written in Blood. The wagon rattled out of Charleston and into the countryside, wheels grinding through mud as the last of the daylight bled into a dull, iron-coloured sky. Solomon sat hunched beside Dr. Hawthorne, his hands wrapped around the leather medical bag in his lap. Each jolt slammed glass vials together with a soft clink, like distant chimes. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the air felt thick, heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. They passed smaller farms first, weather-beaten houses, crooked fences, thin fields. Then the land changed. Fences grew straighter, houses grew taller. Lanterns burned at gateposts carved with family names. It was the outer ring of Charleston's true power, the plantations owned by men whose signatures could move ships, laws, and human lives with equal ease. Solomon watched the names slide by in the fading light, carving each one into memory. Ashford, Middleton, Price. Some he recognized from Hawthorne's whispered dinner conversations. Men who invested in ships, men who supplied cotton mills, men who sent their troublesome stock farther south. Each gate was a reminder that his world rested on the whims of men who considered themselves gentlemen while treating people like tools. At last, the wagon slowed before a set of wrought iron gates taller than the wagon itself. 2 stone pillars flanked the entrance, streaked dark by years of rain. Mounted in the ironwork, picked out in peeling gold paint, was a name Solomon had not seen in years, but knew instantly. Fairfax. For a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. The creak of the wagon, the snort of the horse, Hawthorne's muttered curses, all of it dulled into a low hum. That name did not belong to some stranger. It belonged to the man who had first branded it into Solomon's life. The owner who had bought his parents when Solomon was 8. The man who had sold his sister away screaming. The name of the Virginia planter who had broken his family and then stamped his own title over their memories. Fairfax. Solomon had thought he'd left that name behind when he was sold to Charleston. Seeing it here, more than 500 miles from the Virginia plantation of his childhood, was like being shoved backward into a nightmare he'd never fully escaped. His throat went dry. His fingers tightened around the medical bag until his knuckles ached. Beside him, Hawthorne barely glanced at the sign. "About time," he muttered. "Fairfax keeps us waiting and then calls as if death himself is at the door." The gates creaked open, and the wagon rolled onto a long, tree-lined drive. Live oaks arched overhead, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed like old grey shrouds. Gas lamps flickered along the path, throwing the gravel into sharp relief. Ahead, the plantation house rose out of the darkness, 3 stories of white columns, wide verandas, and windows blazing with light. To anyone else, it was impressive. To Solomon, it was a familiar mask. He knew what usually hid behind such facades: cramped slave quarters tucked out of sight, fields soaked not just with rain, but with sweat and blood, a graveyard without headstones, somewhere just beyond the reach of the lanterns. As they neared the house, figures emerged from the shadows. Enslaved men hurried forward to take the horses' reins. A woman in a plain dress clutched a shawl around her shoulders on the front steps, her face tight with worry. Beside her stood a man in a dark coat, posture rigid, jaw clenched, the master of this place. "Dr. Hawthorne," the man called as the wagon stopped. "You took your time." "Roads are flooded, Mr. Fairfax," Hawthorne replied, climbing down. "If you wanted speed, you should have written to the Almighty, not a doctor." The two men exchanged a thin, humorless smile that had nothing to do with warmth. Fairfax's eyes, pale and sharp, flicked past Hawthorne to Solomon. They lingered just long enough to register ownership, then dismissed him. "Boy," Fairfax snapped, already turning away. "Bring your master's things. My son doesn't have the luxury of waiting." The word boy hit with the dull force of habit, but the name, Fairfax, echoed like a hammer on iron in Solomon's skull. Up close, the man was older than the memory etched in his mind, but the shape of his mouth was the same. The way he walked without ever really seeing the people around him. The way he gave orders as if the air itself owed him obedience. Solomon lifted the medical bag and followed Hawthorne up the wide steps. As he passed the woman in the shawl, Fairfax's wife, he guessed, he caught the edge of her whispered plea. "Please, Elias." He started seizing again. "I can't." "We'll do what we can," Hawthorne said, already analysing the situation like a puzzle. "Where is he?" "Upstairs. First door on the right." Inside, the house smelled of beeswax polish, damp wool, and the sharp, sour edge of sickness. Portraits of Fairfax ancestors lined the walls, stern men in powdered wigs, women in satin, all staring down with the same expression, entitlement carved into oil and canvas. Their painted eyes seemed to follow Solomon as he climbed the stairs behind the doctor, bag in hand. At the bedroom door, Hawthorne paused just long enough to pull a cloth over his mouth and nose. "Be ready," he murmured to Solomon. "If the boy's as bad as they say, I'll need you steady, no fumbling." Solomon nodded once. Whatever storm raged inside him, his hands were still. He had learned long ago to separate his thoughts from his work. A man could be screaming in his face, and he would still measure powders to the grain. He would focus now. Later, if there was a later, he would let himself think about how this man, this house, this name, had rearranged his entire life without ever learning his. They stepped into the room. The smell hit first: sweat, vomit, and the sickly sweetness of a body burning with fever. A boy of about 10 thrashed on the bed, sheets soaked, eyes glassy and unfocused. His lips moved in broken phrases, half-formed words slipping out in a fever dream. His mother knelt beside him, holding a cloth to his head with trembling hands. "Samuel," she whispered. "Samuel, darling, the doctor's here." Hawthorne went to work, his voice clipped and calm. "How long has he been like this?" 2 days, she said. "It started with a headache, then chills. Yesterday he couldn't stop vomiting. This morning he—" Her voice broke as the boy's body convulsed. "Please," Hawthorne motioned to Solomon. "Water, clean rags, and my case." Solomon moved, the old rhythm taking over. He set the bag down, opened it in one practiced motion, laid out instruments and vials on a side table. His eyes scanned the room automatically. Basin, pitcher, windows cracked open to let in the damp night air. In the corner, a second bed, smaller, neatly made. Another child's bed, empty. A toy soldier lay on the floor, its painted face staring at the ceiling. He brought the water and rags to Hawthorne, then approached the bedside opposite the doctor. Up close, the boy's breathing was ragged, uneven. His skin was too hot, pulse racing beneath Solomon's fingers when he checked the wrist. He recognized the pattern, the vicious arc of a fever that could turn into brain swelling, seizures, death. He'd seen it before, in cabins with dirt floors where no doctor came. Hawthorne questioned the parents, what the boy had eaten, whether he'd been out in the rain, if anyone else in the house was sick. While they answered in halting, terrified fragments, Solomon focused on the boy. He dampened a cloth and ran it gently along the child's brow, down his neck, trying to cool the fire beneath the skin. The boy's eyes fluttered. For a heartbeat, he seemed aware, irises locking onto Solomon's face. In that instant, something twisted inside Solomon. This child wore the Fairfax name. He slept in a bed bought with the suffering of people like Solomon's parents. His future, if he survived, might someday include signing papers that bought and sold human beings. And yet, right now, he was just a sick boy, whimpering in fear, clutching blindly at the sheets. "Easy," Solomon murmured, almost under his breath. "Breathe, little man. Just breathe." Hawthorne mixed a dose of laudanum and powdered bark, turning the glass with his fingers. He glanced sideways at Solomon. "Dose for his weight?" "Half a spoon of laudanum," Solomon replied quietly. "And 2 pinches of the bark. No more. His heart's already racing." Hawthorne didn't argue. He adjusted the amounts exactly as Solomon said, then slid an arm under the boy's shoulders to help him drink. The child coughed, gagged, then swallowed. Minutes dragged. The seizure eased. The boy's muscles relaxed by degrees. His breathing steadied, though his temperature still simmered dangerously high. Hawthorne instructed his parents on cool cloths, fresh linen, and how often to wake the boy for water. "If he makes it through the night," the doctor said, "he'll likely live." Fairfax exhaled a long breath he'd been holding. Some tension loosened in his shoulders, but his face stayed stern, almost angry, as if the boy's illness were a personal insult. "You'll stay," he said. It was not a question. "In case it returns." Hawthorne hesitated. He had other patients in the city, other houses waiting. But the Fairfax name carried weight, and the debt this visit would create was worth more than money. "We'll remain until morning," he agreed. He jerked his head towards Solomon. "Set up in the next room. We'll rest in shifts." While Hawthorne spoke with Mr. and Mrs. Fairfax, Solomon slipped back into the hallway, the noise of his own heartbeat suddenly too loud in his ears. He walked to a window at the far end, pushed it open a little wider, and let the cool night air hit his face. From here, he could see more of the plantation. Rows of shadowed buildings in the distance, slave quarters, by their shape. A faint glow from small fires or lanterns. The murmur of voices carried on the damp air, too far to make out words, but close enough to recognize tone. Tired, resigned, trying to carve slivers of normal life into the spaces the day left behind. Once, when he was a boy on the Virginia Fairfax plantation, Solomon had stood in a similar hallway, staring out at similar rows of shacks. That night, his sister had been taken away in a wagon, sold to settle a debt. He'd pressed his forehead to the glass then too, and watched until the lantern light disappeared. He hadn't seen her since. Now here he was again, in a different state, in a different house, under the same name. Life had circled back on itself in a way that felt almost deliberate, like a hand pushing him to remember that the story was not finished. Behind him, footsteps approached. Solomon tensed, then forced himself to relax as Fairfax's voice cut through the dim hallway. "You," the man said. "Solomon, is it?" It startled him that the master remembered his name at all. "Yes, sir." Fairfax stood beside him at the window, gaze on the distant quarters. "They say you've saved more than a few lives in this city." Solomon kept his eyes forward. "I work for Dr. Hawthorne, sir." Fairfax made a small sound, part snort, part acknowledgement. "Doctors are only as good as the hands that mix their medicines. I've been told as much." He paused. "If my boy lives, you'll have done me a service." The word boy sat bitter on Solomon's tongue. He thought of all the times he'd heard that word thrown at him like a stone. Now it wrapped around a child with a bed, a mother, a last name that opened doors. "I just do what I'm told, sir," he said. Fairfax turned his head, studying him with narrowed eyes. "You remind me of a hand I once had in Virginia. Quiet. Worked with herbs too. African woman taught him, if I recall." Solomon's chest tightened. His grandmother. "Fairfax Plantation," the man went on, oblivious to the storm behind Solomon's stillness. "We had good stock there, lost some of it when the market shifted." He shrugged, as if referring to misplaced tools. "Life moves on. Life moves on." The phrase landed with the cold finality of a shovel hitting stone. For Fairfax, life had moved on from that Virginia estate to this grand house in South Carolina, with more land, more wealth, more power. For Solomon, life moved on had meant being ripped from his family, chained, shipped, renamed, resold. Standing beside the man who had profited from that suffering and hearing him speak of it like a ledger adjustment, something inside Solomon hardened into shape. Not a wild, wordless rage that he had known before, and it burned out too quickly. This was different. It was quiet, cold, and precise, like a blade being sharpened in the dark. He realized then that he was in a position no one like Fairfax would ever suspect. These men trusted him with their veins, their lungs, their racing hearts. They drank what he mixed, swallowed what he measured, slept under the watch of his hands. They believed chains and laws were enough to guarantee his obedience. They did not understand that a man trained to balance life and death in drops and pinches could, if he chose, set the scales the other way. That night, as the house settled and the feverish boy tossed and muttered in half-sleep, Solomon sat in a chair between the bedroom and the hall, listening. To Hawthorne's soft snores from the adjoining room, to the boy's restless breathing, to the faint, steady rhythm of rain starting again on the roof. He thought of his grandmother's quiet warnings, of his sister's cries the last time he saw her, of the word stock falling from Fairfax's lips like ash. And for the first time in his life, he did more than endure the weight of their crimes. He began to imagine what it would look like to make men like Fairfax answer for them. Not in a courtroom that would never hear his voice. Not in whispered prayers alone, but in a language they understood perfectly. Fear, loss, and the sudden undeniable knowledge that they were not untouchable. Solomon watched the doorway, the sleeping boy, the dark hall beyond. His hands rested in his lap, still as stone. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. In the quiet that followed, an idea took root, a plan not yet clear, not yet shaped into steps, but alive all the same. A seed of revenge, planted in the house of the very man whose name he'd been forced to carry. Chapter 3. The First Grave. Months passed after that rain-soaked night at the Fairfax plantation, but the seed planted in Solomon's mind grew in silence, fed by every casual order, every overheard conversation, every glimpse of the chains that bound not just his body, but his entire world. The boy, Samuel Fairfax, survived the fever. His recovery whispered through Charleston as proof of Dr. Hawthorne's skill, with Solomon's hands unmentioned, as always. Yet that survival became Solomon's first quiet victory, a thread he could pull when the time came. Hawthorne, grateful for the prestige, began sending Solomon back to the Fairfax estate alone for routine checkups, ostensibly to monitor the boy's lingering weakness, but really because Mrs. Fairfax insisted on the Negro with the herbs. These visits granted Solomon something rarer than freedom: access. He moved through the house unchallenged, past parlours thick with cigar smoke, up polished stairs that creaked under his weight, into rooms where the family let down their guards. He saw ledgers stacked on desks, letters half-written about cotton shipments and slave auctions, portraits of stern ancestors whose fortunes rested on broken backs. More importantly, he met the people who made the machine run. In the kitchen, away from white eyes, he spoke with Aggie, the head cook, an older woman with scarred knuckles and eyes that missed nothing. Over shared scraps of cornbread in the pre-dawn hours, She painted the full picture of life under Master Thomas Fairfax. "He's not the worst," she said one morning, her voice low as she stirred a pot of grits. "Whips less than some. But when he sells whole families. Got a trader comes monthly, takes the young ones first, says they fetch more unbroken." Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling back to Solomon's own lost sister. Aggie also spoke of Fairfax's inner circle, the 6 overseers who lived in a row of clapboard cabins behind the stables, each one a petty king of the fields. There was Grimes, the headman, who tallied cotton quotas with a ledger and a horsewhip. Lyle, who favoured locking lazy workers in a smokehouse overnight, and others whose names Solomon committed to memory like ingredients in a deadly draught. These were the men who enforced Fairfax's will, who turned abstract ownership into daily terror. They drank together on Saturdays, boasting of quotas met and lessons taught, oblivious to the healer who refilled their water glasses during house calls. But it was Fairfax himself who crystallized Solomon's plan. During one visit, as Solomon adjusted a tonic for the recovering boy, he overheard the master in his study, voice raised in anger. "That Virginia property's bleeding me dry. Taxes, poor yields. Need to liquidate stock here too. Start with the troublemakers." Liquidate. The word echoed the auction block of Solomon's childhood. Fairfax paced, unaware of the shadow beyond the half-open door. A man who had just learned his enemy's vulnerability, financial pressure mounting from distant debts. That night, back in Charleston's dim attic, Solomon began testing boundaries. His healer's bag held more than remedies, hidden pouches of nightshade berries, dried hemlock, and calamus root, plants that mimicked natural illness or eased pain into permanent sleep. He experimented in secret, on stray cats from the alleys and rats in the hawthorn stable, noting how much induced collapse without trace, how long until breath stopped. Not murder yet, but knowledge, the sharp edge of possibility. The opportunity came sooner than expected, in the sweltering heat of summer 1842. Grimes, the brutal head overseer, fell ill after a plantation barbecue, gripping his stomach, retching bile, dismissed by Fairfax as too much whiskey. Hawthorne was away in Savannah. Solomon was summoned alone. He arrived at the overseer's cabin as dusk settled, the air thick with cicadas and the sour reek of vomit. Grimes lay on a cot, pale and sweating, convinced it was his end. "You," he croaked, recognizing the healer. "Fix me. I run this place." Solomon moved deliberately, mixing a draught of ginger and willow for the nausea, laced with just enough powdered foxglove to slow the heart unpredictably. "Drink slow," he said, helping Grimes sip. "Rest now. It'll pass." As the man drifted into labored sleep, Solomon lingered, watching the chest rise and fall unevenly. He noted the shallow breaths, the blue tinge creeping into lips. No one would question an overseer's death from overindulgence. Men like Grimes burned bright and brief. By midnight, Grimes was gone. Heart failed, the plantation whispered later, from strong drink and hard living. Fairfax shrugged it off, promoting Lyle to head overseer without a second thought. To the white world, it was natural turnover. To Solomon, watching from the shadows as they buried Grimes in a shallow plot by the swamp, it was the first grave. Proof that his hands, trusted for healing, could deliver justice unseen. Word spread quietly among the enslaved. Aggie pressed a hand to his arm one dawn. "Heard about Grimes. You be careful, Solomon. Fire like that spreads." He met her eyes, saying nothing, but the shared silence held understanding. Resistance wasn't always armies or uprisings. Sometimes it was a single, precise act, buried like a seed in soft earth. Yet victory tasted bitter. Grimes had been a monster, but his death changed nothing fundamental. Fields still burned under the sun, quotas still crushed spirits. Fairfax tightened rules, suspecting laziness among the workers. Solomon realized one grave wasn't enough. Fairfax's circle numbered 9 now, counting the master himself. 6 overseers, Hawthorne as the enabler, and 2 merchant allies who supplied the trader wagons. Each one profited from the system, each one replaceable in the machine. As fall leaves turned the plantation gold, Solomon refined his list. He memorized routines. Grimes succeeded by Lyle, who favored the smokehouse. Next would be the man who chained field hands to trees overnight. Each death would mimic accident or illness, spaced months apart, invisible to outsiders. Fairfax would feel the losses mount, debts pressing harder, paranoia growing, never suspecting the healer who saved his son's life, now walked his halls like a shadow with a ledger of his own. By winter, as the first frost rimed the fields, Solomon knew the shape of it fully. 9 graves, 1 for each pillar of Fairfax's world. Not wild vengeance, but a slow unraveling, methodical, patient, inevitable. He would be the ghost in their medicine, the hand that healed until it didn't. And when Fairfax stood alone over the last empty plot, ruined and questioning his God, Solomon would let him see, just for a moment, the eyes of the man whose family he had shattered long ago. Chapter 4. The 9th Grave. Winter deepened over the Fairfax plantation, frosting the cotton fields white and turning breath to ghosts in the morning air. Solomon's ledger of vengeance unfolded with the patience of seasons, each death spaced carefully, disguised as fever, bad heart, or the drink, always just plausible enough to pass without suspicion. Lyle, the smokehouse tyrant, went next in early 1843, clutching his chest after a bitter quarrel with Fairfax over quotas. His replacement lasted 7 months before a fall from the stable loft snapped his neck. One by one, the overseers vanished. The chainman drowned in a shallow creek. The quota enforcer wasted away from dysentery, until only 3 remained, eyes darting at shadows, fingers twitching toward pistols that stayed holstered. Fairfax, debts mounting from Virginia and crop failures, blamed bad luck and cursed land, never his healer. Solomon's visits became ritual. Mrs. Fairfax still called for tonics for Samuel, now a wary boy of 12, who watched the enslaved man with unspoken gratitude and faint unease. In the kitchen shadows, Aggie tracked his progress with nods and hushed warnings. 4 down, they talking ghosts now. Whispers spread through the quarters, tales of Burra death walking the big house, collecting what was owed. No uprisings, no fires, just absence, like holes punched in the plantation's spine. Solomon moved among them all, face calm, hands steady, the trusted ghost. Hawthorne noticed the pattern too late. By 1845, rumours reached Charleston, Fairfax losing men like loose teeth. The doctor cornered Solomon in the apothecary yard one dusk, voice sharp. "People say poison. You hear anything?" Solomon met his eyes evenly. "Illness comes in waves, doctor." "Fields breed it." Hawthorne grunted, unconvinced, but his reliance on Solomon's skills and the fees from fearful planters silenced deeper questions. Yet trust frayed. Hawthorne began double-checking drafts, watching from doorways. Solomon adjusted. Slower poisons, rarer doses, always 1 step ahead. The merchant allies fell quietly. One choked on a bad oyster stew laced with subtle nightshade. Tragic, but common in humid summers. The trader who hauled families south vanished on a foggy road, his wagon found overturned, robbers assumed. Fairfax's circle shrank to himself, Hawthorne, and 2 trembling overseers who jumped at owl calls. Debts crushed him. Virginia taxes unpaid, cotton prices crashing, overseers scarce and skittish. He sold land, then slaves, not families, under Aggie's watchful eye, but enough to stem the bleed. Paranoia took root. He patrolled at night with a lantern, muttering of curses and conspiracies. In spring 1846, Hawthorne confronted Fairfax during a desperate house call. "Your losses aren't natural. Someone's tampering." Fairfax, hollow-eyed, waved it off. "Superstition. Fix my headaches first." That night, as Solomon mixed a calming tonic of valerian and calamus, enough to muddle wits but not kill outright. Fairfax lingered in the kitchen doorway, staring. "You," he rasped. "You're from my Virginia place, aren't you? The herbs boy." Memory flickered in his eyes, connecting dots long buried. Solomon poured slowly, saying nothing. Fairfax drank, swayed, then retreated upstairs, unease hardening to dread. The eighth grave claimed the last overseer in autumn fog, a hunting accident, buckshot from his own gun. Hawthorne now refused visits, sending apprentices instead. Fairfax stood alone, estate crumbling, fields overgrown, quarters half empty from quiet escapes, enabled by Solomon's whispers of safe paths north. Mrs. Fairfax took Samuel to relatives in town, fleeing the bad air. Letters piled unopened, creditors circling. The 9th came on a moonless December night in 1847, 4 years to the day since Grimes's death. Solomon slipped onto the plantation unbidden, bag in hand, under pretense of a final check on rumors of the master's collapse. The house loomed dark, windows shuttered, only a single lamp burning in Fairfax's study. Inside, the man sat slumped at his desk, unshaven, surrounded by crumpled bills and half-empty bottles. The air stank of sweat, stale tobacco, and despair, the smell of a kingdom undone. "You," Fairfax croaked, rising unsteadily. Recognition hit full. Virginia's boy, it was you, all of it. No rage, just exhausted certainty. Solomon closed the door softly. "Everything breaks eventually, Master Fairfax, even empires." He set the bag down, withdrawing a vial, clear liquid, odorless, the culmination of years, a concentrated distillate that mimicked heart palsy. Fairfax lunged weakly, knocking over a chair, but Solomon sidestepped, force-feeding the dose amid gasps and curses. "My sister," Solomon said quietly, as the man's struggles weakened. "My parents. Your stock. Lives move on, you said." Fairfax's eyes bulged, hands clawing air, then stilled. No screams, no spectacle, just silence, the master reduced to a husk. Solomon dragged the body alone to the old slave graveyard beyond the fields, unmarked plots where families like his rested forgotten. He dug by lantern light, soil heavy with roots and rain, lowering Fairfax feet first into a pit sized for one more debt. No stone, no words, just earth patted smooth, blending with the rest. By dawn, he was gone, back to Charleston, the trusted healer once more. The plantation dissolved, sold piecemeal, Samuel sent north to school under a new name, whispers fading into legend. Solomon continued under Hawthorne until 1850, then vanished. Some said Canada, others the deep swamps. Charleston folklore remembered the 9 graves, a cautionary spectre. No trials, no confessions, justice as invisible as the hands that dealt it. In the end, one man's ledger balanced another's, not with fire or blade, but precision, patience, and the quiet power of knowing exactly how fragile power truly was. Outro Solomon's story faded into Charleston's shadows, a silent testament to the human cost of a system built on broken lives. One man's quiet justice exposed the fragility of power, reminding us that even in the darkest chains, the will to balance the scales endures. True or woven from whispers, it challenges us to remember the untold resistance that shaped a nation's hidden history. That's the chilling legend of Solomon's revenge. Thanks for watching Faded Truths History. If this story gripped you, smash that like button, subscribe for more forgotten truths, and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. Share your thoughts below. What's the most haunting tale of defiance you've heard? See you in the next one.